Good morning, everybody. I'm Carrie Barrett, the new-ish president of this wonderful place. I have friends that say, you have to stop saying new. And I said, but it's still only 4.5 months. My last job was 30 years. So it feels really, really, really new to me, Stu. And by new, I mean I'm just so curious, so interested, and so in awe of programs like this, which are pulled together by my great staff, my great colleagues, who the garden, look at the garden's 3 pillars of excellence, which is science, horticulture, and education, not necessarily in that order. It could be horticulture, science, and education. But 3 great pillars of what we do here, each one of which is so related to the next. But then within that, coming up with what our panelists and speakers will talk about today, ecology, creating a new garden ethic, which helps us to educate through horticulture with gardeners who really do have a great knowledge of the science of plants. And that's something that I think that we will continue to be on the forefront of, even as we manage our beautiful campus, becoming more and more interested about how plants and vegetation are managed outside of this campus. This Cultivating a New Garden Ethic is part of an ongoing series of conversations, the connection between gardening and the health of the larger environment. And I can't think of, nowadays I think you'd have to be under a rock to not really care about the larger environment of the world. We're not climatologists here at NYBG, but the things that we do are helpful. We provide resources and just the basic knowledge. The fact that you're here today shows that we're all interested in these topics, topics that might seem peripheral, but are actually exactly what we're talking about. We've done previous symposia on the health of forests, our native flora, the alarming increase of invasive species, and current trends in ecological restoration of the urban and rural environments. Today's speakers, and I'm so glad that you 4 are here, will continue the conversation about how we, as gardeners and green industry professionals and environmentalists, work together to protect our imperiled biodiversity. So I'm going to right now turn the podium over to my great colleague Todd Forrest, our Arthur Ross VP for Horticulture and Living Collections, who will give us a brief overview and introduce our 4 speakers. Enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, and good morning and welcome, everybody. Really, just to echo Carrie's thoughts, your interest in these subjects is so inspiring and hopeful to me. I love seeing you guys here on a cold, late November morning. It means that you care and you're ready to do the good work of helping us all improve the health of our planet. We're lucky today to have 4 great speakers to continue the ongoing conversation about the role of gardening in promoting the health of the larger environment. Before I introduce them, a few years ago I gathered with my amazing colleagues in horticulture who have the most wonderful range of skills and the deepest knowledge you can ever imagine. And I sort of asked everybody, you know, what's the lowest bar as professional horticulturists at a public garden, you know, with a rose garden and exhibitions, you know, what's the lowest bar that we should hope to accomplish in terms of our relationship to the environment? And we all agreed, you'll be happy to hear, that the lowest bar is to do no harm. And that might seem kind of small or insignificant or trite, but the reality is that traditionally, many horticulture practices, like many agriculture practices, like many of our life practices, haven't always been the most beneficial to the larger environment. So we're dedicated to pursuing excellence in horticulture while doing no harm. So that begs the next obvious question. Well, if we can nail doing no harm, can we use gardening to do good? And that's where we're at right now, and that's why we've put together this panel this morning, and that's why we put together this series of symposia over the past several years. It's not necessarily enough to do no harm. Let's figure out how we can do good through our roles as gardeners and horticulturists. So today's speakers will kind of explore this from three different perspectives. The first speaker will be Jan Merriweather, Program Director at Plant Right, an organization in California devoted to developing partnerships between the green industry, conservation groups, researchers, and home gardeners to promote alternatives to invasive plants. She will discuss how collaborative efforts have made a difference in California and are making a difference in California. She'll be followed by Larry Weiner, principal and founder of Larry Weiner Landscape Associates, who will describe how he has integrated the principles of ecological restoration into garden designs to create beautiful and satisfying and healthy and beneficial gardens on a variety of scales. And finally, we have a duo of speakers, biologist, educator, and author Scott Freeman, and his wife, artist Susan Leopold Freeman, who happens to be the granddaughter of Aldo Leopold, so we are in the presence of ecological royalty. They'll talk about Aldo Leopold's notion of the land ethic and share stories of how they have put it into action in small and big ways. After the presentations, Jessica Schuler and I will join the group for a moderated discussion and a question and answer, which will be a lot of fun. So you'll save your questions to the end. So now it's my honor to introduce Jan Merriweather.
Good morning, everybody. Really jazzed to be here, and I'd like to get really honest right away. Raise your hand if you've ever been totally taken in by deceptively beautiful invasive plants. Let me see a show of hands. Yes, it's not difficult to do, is it? They're terribly beautiful. Okay, and the subheading, the unofficial subheading of this talk is really, don't get romanced by invasive plants. So this is what we're going to cover. The goal is that each of you has an even better understanding of the really solid connection between healthy landscapes and our gardens. I'd also like to introduce what makes our Plant Right program tick, so you could share in your work or just at home. And most importantly, I'd like you to be able to take home some really, some tools and resources that you can put to work right away in your garden or with your clients. I'm going to open up with another question. How did these invasive plants get here in the first place? Could anyone offer a guess?
It's the plant hunters.
Plant hunters, nursery, you got it. The largest pathway for invasives in the country today has been through the nursery trade. And it's not with malintent. No grower set out to say, I want to be known for selling the best and most rigorous invasive plants. It's just plants adapt. There's this thing called the lag phase, which we're going to touch on in a moment. And we just didn't know better. But today we do know better, and we can do better. And the key to that success is understanding that there are just 3 types of invasive plants. And here they are. Whoop. I skipped. So let me go back. Half of the known invasive plants in California came through the nursery trade. And then let's get into the 3 types of invasive plants. We've got examples of the burning bush, which are the known invaders. So some of those may be regulated now. Maybe they're in the noxious plant category. But many are still in the supply chain in many states. And then we've got the emerging invasive, which may not be on the invasive plant list around the country, but they're definitely in the supply chain. And here's an example of purple cumin, New York. And then the not yet introduced invasive plant. Okay? And understanding these 3 types of invasive plants is the first step in understanding something called the invasion curve. It's probably familiar to many of you. So we've got the lag phase along the top, along the bottom, and that you can see that as the area of the invasive infestation grows, the costs go up. And we get to a point of pretty much no return, or as Sarah mentioned, it's just beyond control. There's no no coming back, and the costs go way up. So the point of this slide is that when we consider those 3 types of invasive plants, we've got the known invasives up at the top, we've got the emerging invasives in this area, and of course the challenge is public awareness is just only beginning right when the plants are getting to that beyond the point of no return. Then down here we have when plants are being introduced. So if we're going to manage this issue, we really want to focus on earlier detection. Okay, let's talk about new plant introductions. The nursery industry is just like the consumer product industry. Everyone's working to introduce the next sexy, new, best-selling, most beautiful plant. And this, I just Googled best-selling plant, and I found this catalog picture, Google Images, and what they're touting is not unlike what most of the growers are touting. The best colors, the most vigorous plants, the ones with the best possible traits and genetics. And over 1,000 new plants are introduced, well over 1,000 each year, okay? And the good news is only a tiny percent will pose an invasive threat in any given marketplace, okay? The bad news is only that tiny percent will pose a problem because that little percent wreaks a lot of havoc both on taxpayer wallets and, of course, the environment. Now we've got another quick exercise, and if you could break up into groups of 2 or 3, I'd like you to describe to your seatmate, what do you look for when you go shopping? Could be to buy a plant for a friend or for your own landscape business or for your backyard. So we're going to take 30 seconds and just say hello to your neighbor. And just share what you look for in a plant. Oh, thank you very much. All right. Okay. Ready to come back? Here we go. All right. We don't love talking about plants, do we? It's great. Okay, so hold those thoughts. Hold those thoughts. We're going to totally switch gears. What are the traits that invasive plants tend to possess? Ponder that, okay? And you can share with friends, and then in 30 seconds we're going to come back and see if your findings, how they measure up to the findings that we hear from the industry. Cool. Here we go. So is anyone seeing an interesting connection here? Looks like it's going to continue to be really challenging to differentiate between the beautiful and the terribly beautiful. Okay? Consumers are demanding easy to grow, really hardy, weather-resistant plants. And also plants, as one grower, Spring Meadow in Michigan said, I was on a tour of their growing grounds not too long ago, and he said, you wouldn't believe our customers are asking us to grow plants that should never grow in these types of climates. Okay? But they're so beautiful. Okay? So it is challenging, and it's not just challenging for home gardeners. it's equally challenging for the growers who want to market these plants in different parts of the country in their market, and for landscape professionals. Okay, how do you know before you grow? And programs like Plant Right exist to do just that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the program in California. I'd like to introduce you first to our parent organization by the name of Sustainable Conservation. And for the past 25 years, Sustainable Conservation has been working to advance more environmentally friendly practices. Primarily that businesses in the agricultural sector, be it commercial dairies, a variety of commercial ag. We've worked with the brake pad industry to phase out copper in brake pads, all on a voluntary basis, no regulation involved. And of course, horticulture. And we're known for finding common ground, cutting through red tape. We know that can be really frustrating and sometimes just glacially slow to see environmental progress. But we believe that finding common ground really is our most precious resource in getting the industry to adopt more environmentally friendly practices. The story behind Plant Right is this. In 2005, the Nature Conservancy California approached Sustainable Conservation, knowing our reputation, and said, you know, we've been buying up all this land in California to preserve the biodiversity, but the lands are being overrun by invasive plants. And the worst thing is, these invasive plants are still for sale. So it seems Sustainable Conservation might be perfectly poised to work with the horticultural industry on getting the industry to take a more proactive role in being part of the solution instead of continuing to be that significant vector of invasive plants. Of course, we love the idea. So meet Plant Right. Plant Right was established in 2005, and since that time we've been working to protect our wildlands from invasive plants by collaborating with the nursery trade on voluntarily phasing out invasive plants and promoting non-invasive alternatives. The logos that you see here represent a combination of our steering committee and plant list committee members, all of whom are volunteers, and their organizations. And then a couple of our larger Plant Right retail nursery partners, Home Depot and Lowe's there. And you see that it's a diverse group representing the trade, NGOs and conservation, government, and science. And our MO is science-based, collaborative, and voluntary. And this is, I'm missing the clicker here. Here we go. Okay? Those are our key tenets, as they are the key tenets for sustainable conservation. So the first thing we did when we set up our steering committee, about 18 individuals representing these different sectors, we went on a trip. Isn't a trip the best way to test any new relationship? Okay? And where did we go? We went to show them a couple invasion sites, and this is in the San Diego area along the river. There were infestations of Brazilian pepper tree, of course, arundo, grass that's even taller than I am. See eucalyptus here. And many of these industry members had never seen an invasion site, and they really got the problem. They really felt it viscerally. Can anyone guess where the next field trip was?
Nursery.
The nursery, yes indeed. We have the pleasure of, I don't know if, I would imagine Nicholas Stadden has probably spoken here in the past, but he's a plantsman, lovely British accent. From Monrovia, he now represents some other growers, but we went to the Visalia Monrovia grounds, and we learned about the many challenges that growers face, from labor shortages to the managing plant and plant pest disease, water issues, having to do more with less when it comes to nutrient and water efficiency, and fairly paper-thin profit margins, okay? And this experience helped the conservation, the eco-groovies, and the Plant Right staff understand why invasive plants aren't necessarily on the top 3 priorities for growers, okay? So growing out empathy. If y'all haven't purchased hydrangeas from Monrovia, they're really, really beautiful. Okay, so now we're going to get into growing the Plant Right program. We've got our steering committee in place, and what you're looking at now are the key components of the Plant Right program. At the center, we've got the plant list, and the plant list is supported and guided by the annual nursery survey, a resource called the Plant Risk Evaluator, and then that content is pushed out in various forms in our social media and continuing education, and then, of course, to serve our retail nursery partnership. So let's take a look at the plant list. So just a reminder, invasive behavior is very much a local and regional matter, right? So certain plants in one state may be perfectly well behaved in another. And the larger states, like California, New York, Texas, certain plants can be invasive in one region and not another. And so our plant list does acknowledge that. Okay? And this is page 1 of the plant list. And some people are shocked that they're only, it's only a 2-page invasive list, okay? And the reason is we want to focus on the top invasive priorities, and we're just focusing on those that you would find at the garden centers, okay? Our partner, California Invasive Plant Council, they have over 250 invasive plants on their list, so they're doing comprehensive lists. So you can see we've got the glam shots of the invasive plants, because we do want them to recognize them. We don't want them to be romanced by invasive plants. On the far left, we've got the suggested non-alternatives. It's really important that you coach the do's, not just the don'ts. And then, of course, the climate suitability. How does a plant get added to the list? Okay, there are 4 steps. First, it would have to appear on the California invasive plant list, or it screens as a high risk potential with the plant risk evaluator, which we'll talk about in just a second. But this gets to the point of the emerging invasive category, because we have plants on our list that are not on the California invasive plant list, okay? Because they manage the plants that are widely established, the known invasives, whereas we focus on the emerging and the known invasives. Okay, plants also have to be seen at more than 3% of retail. The potential invasion range is significant, and the decision to add them has to be supported by our plant list committee and the steering committees. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of the plant list committee. These individuals, their wisdom is rivaled only by how well connected they are. Okay, we've got 4 industries on this group represented. We've got 2 plant scientists, we've got 2 conservation leaders, and we've got the senior botanist at the California Department of Food and Ag to help us in making these decisions on whether we add a plant or not. And I'll bet you didn't know that there's a retirement home for invasive plants in California, and it's called plantright.org, okay? When an invasive plant on our list is no longer found, is found at 1% or less of the nurseries for 3 years running, we will retire that plant, because we want the list to be really actionable and manageable for our retail and grower and landscape professional landscape partners. Okay, so we'll retire the plants. So now we're going to move on to the nursery survey. There's a saying, if you can measure it, you can manage it. Well, this is what the nursery survey helps us do. The purpose is to update our list, to track how invasive plants are trending around the state, and then just to inform our outreach and strategy. And we could not do the survey without the generosity and the incredible talents of the UC, the University of California Master Gardener statewide program. Each year, over 150 of the Master Gardeners volunteer their time to help us complete the survey. And we also tap the talents of the Native Plant Society, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Association of Professional Landscape Design Association. And here's just some statistics from the most recent survey. And if you're really data hungry, we have a 2-page fact sheet or a 20-odd page fact sheet put together by the consultants that advise us on the survey and help us with the appropriate store sampling size in each county and all that good stuff. So that's the survey. And then we get into the other key resource that feeds our plant list called the Plant Risk Evaluator, or PRE for short. All you scientists out there will recognize the PLOS One website. This is where our PRE model research was published in 2015. And PRE, think of it as a weed risk assessment tool designed especially for the ornamental industry. It's a user-friendly tool. It balances ease of use with scientific credibility. Okay, it's kind of a better mousetrap. And the logos that you see represent the researchers who led the development of the PRE model. It started at University of Washington Botanic Garden under the leadership of the late and very great Professor Sarah Reichard and her graduate student Lisbeth Seebacher. And in 2011, that project was transitioned down to UC Davis to Joe DiTommaso, who was the plant chair, the plant sciences department at that time, and then his graduate student, Christiana Consor. As soon as that was published, we set to work to build a database and a tool that could be used by all who would need a tool like this. The California Invasive Plant Council is using this now as part of their early detection work. But our primary goal in PRE, aside from it supporting the development of the plant list, is that it be embraced as a resource and a decision support tool for the trade so they can help them know before they grow if a plant poses an invasive risk in any of their markets. Remember the new plant introductions and the emerging invasive opportunity. So that's the role that PRE plays. Social media, enough said about that. Continuing education. We have a very simple module. It's about a 30-minute program, but it consists of a little video. There's a handbook, there's a quiz, but it was developed for the landscape professionals and the nursery professionals who have an existing training program. So it was just one more way to supplement their training. Okay? And we work closely with the California Certified Nursery Professionals, the largest nursery trade association in the state, on this. They've been super supportive. Then we come to our Retail Nursery Partnership Program, started in 2013, and what we ask of the nursery partners is they do these 3 things. They sell only non-invasives, they phase out the invasives, and sometimes it might take a little longer than we want, but usually it's within 6 months, and to graduate their plant buyers, and ideally anyone who's customer-facing. Okay? And the reception with the retailers, it ran the gamut, okay? For the most part, it's been very successful, and particularly if you look at the volume of sales when we can get the big box on board and the smaller chains. This is a 9-store chain. The CEO said, you know, this program is in total alignment with our values. It helps us demonstrate that we care, not only to our customers, but to our staff. One way we measure our program's progress is through the presence of invasive plants at retail, which the survey helps us measure. And let's see how we're doing based on the last survey. Okay? The color bars reflect the years from 2014 to 2017, and the surveys by big box, small chain, or independents. And you can see that we've had the most dramatic increase at the big box level, some at the small chain, and the independents has been the most challenging. And they've said, you know, we support you, but we just can't afford to miss a sale. And so that's been a real challenge for us. So there you have the summary of our program components and where we work along the invasive curve. And I encourage each of you all to, you know, take anything you can from what you've just heard and really think along the lines of those 3 types of invasives: the known, the emerging, and the not yet introduced. Time to put the U in solution. And truly, in growing healthier landscapes, everyone has a role to play. There's a lot of overlap in the steps you can take here, from home gardeners to retailers to breeders or growers, collectors. And I'm going to just, I'll call out one or two, but let you pick what you think might work best for you and your community. Definitely support your local PRISM group. How many people are involved with PRISM? Great, great. Keep supporting PRISM. Retail nurseries, again. Any retail nurseries here? No? Okay. Really helpful to have a do not buy list for your staff, along with the alternatives. Any breeders, growers, or plant collectors here? Okay. Landscape professionals, yes, I know that there are a few. Great, welcome. Do any of you all have currently a do not specify kind of policy? Something to consider. But everyone can make the effort to know before we grow, right? Conservation groups, thank you, thank you, thank you for what you're doing. And of course, New York Botanic Garden, focus on science, education, horticulture. Keep it up. Keep doing, keep leading. Coach the dues, find common ground. It's there, it really is. And do keep in mind, the facts are critical. Science matters. But you gotta remember that it takes growing empathy with the facts to really find that common ground. Quickly, just some lessons learned. Work the high-impact levers in the system. Independents have been really challenging and time-consuming to recruit as partners. The smaller chain and big box have been more accepting and open. If you have plant lists, please make sure that they're substantiated with science. Okay, we hear from nurseries all the time that, oh, we're being attacked by these plant lists, that there's really nothing behind them except someone just doesn't like the plant. Okay? Coaching the dues, we talked about that. And then this is really challenging not to be romanced by invasive plants, because there are new beautiful plants coming out all the time. So would you all join me in repeating the last sentence starting with always? Here we go. Always be learning, persistent, optimistic, and collaborating. Repeat. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, and NYBG. That was a really interesting talk, and I stimulated a lot of thoughts on my part that I won't go into, or you won't see anything that I had to say here in 30 minutes. There's a lot of interesting approaches that I thought Jan brought up. So I'm going to talk about integrating restoration techniques in garden design, and this is really the idea of bringing science into what is primarily thought of as an artistic endeavor, as in garden design, and bringing real, again, facts matter, real science into what we're doing without obliterating in any way, shape, or form the artistic sophistication that good garden designers practice and have always practiced. So, incorporate ecological patterns and natural processes of change into design, planting, and management protocols. And I really want to highlight natural processes, because I think that's the missing link. As we can see here today from the lectures and your presence and what's going on out in the landscape world, there's a lot of positive movement towards ecological landscape approaches of various types. And I think it's not so hard anymore to convince people that this is a good way to go. I think what is hard is to know how to do it. And that, I think, is where we need to spend a lot of time. And where that can be achieved is not just using native plants and understanding where they will grow, but understanding the natural processes that occur in nature that govern the success, failure of these plants. And that's what I want to talk about today. So first of all, you probably can't read the bottom there. The chairs are in the way and you're too far away, but it says, if you do nothing, stuff grows. And here's an example of it. All right, what's there? And some grass or some kind of broadleaf perennial, but let's talk about what that is. This is at the base of a stone wall, and there's a meadow that stone wall runs through, and there's a path, a mowed grass path that is maintained along the wall. And you walk up the path, and on your right is the wall, and on your left is a meadow. I directed the folks that maintain this property to not mow in the spring 18 inches, an 18-inch swath along the edge of the stone wall. And they were weed whacking right up to the edge. And I asked them just to stop mowing it, and they did. And so I visited the spot periodically during the season to determine what's growing where they were not mowing. And in some places, it was weedy and nothing that got me too excited. And in other instances, there were things growing, some from the meadow, other things that just came in naturally that were desirable. So the next step for me was to take flags and just mark off a couple of little semicircles where there was particularly nice vegetation coming up, and then go back to the mowing folks and say, okay, you can go back to mowing right up to the wall, but when you come to one of my little semicircle flag things, go around it. And they did. And now there's a height differential and the flags get taken away, and now just don't mow that taller stuff. Just mow the lawn where it's already being mowed. And here's one of the results of it. There's an elderberry. Now, you can see the meadow on the right. That wasn't even part of the meadow planting. That was just a natural recruited shrub native to that area that came in. And all I did was let the darn thing live and stop mowing it. Does that mean that we can just let landscapes go and we will have wonderful, pleasurable, wildlife-friendly places? No, we all understand that the invasive species and the soil disturbance and all the things that the deer population, all the things that occur have dramatic effects on the vegetative trajectory, and more times than not, it ain't good. However, there is good within it. And so the idea here is to start letting things happen and then judiciously determine what we're going to do about it. And so here are some of the ways, some of the thought processes that go into selecting plants and managing them. First of all, horticulture is very general in determining when a plant is the right plant, right place. You can't argue with that. But how specific are we going to be when we're determining the right place? Horticulture is kind of, well, sun, shade, clay, sand, real wet, real dry. Very general suggestions that would determine whether a plant is right for where you want to plant it. But I would take it a step further and say, I want to know what is the habitat that plant naturally occurs, and is it occurring in this place, or is it occurring in a habitat that is very similar to this place? And that is more deep, so to speak, than just determining it's sunny and it's shady. And I go a little deeper into that often, but in 30 minutes I'm not going to. So in order to get 40 acres to kind of do what you want it to do, you can't look at it like a horticulturist. You got to start understanding process to make that work. And there's another ramification to matching a plant to the habitat from which it naturally occurs. And here's an example of it. Obviously you want it to grow well, and you're making an assumption that if I put it where it normally grows, it should be able to grow well in that condition. So here's Indian paintbrush. Indian paintbrush is ubiquitous in the southwestern United States. If you go to Texas Hill Country in February, March, you might see acres and acres of this plant. It is also native to Connecticut, where you see it planted here. However, in Texas, you've got limestone soils that are high pH, calcareous situations, where Indian paintbrush, that's what it wants. In Connecticut, by and large, you have acidic soils that Indian paintbrush does not want. But there are occasional limestone veins in Connecticut. That's where Indian paintbrush would be native. And if you are on one of those veins, it's a great plant for you. And if you are not, it is not. The obvious reason is it'll grow better. But there's another reason. And that is, well, here we have it. The plants are getting thicker and denser as that patch develops, and this was just planted in isolated patches in this meadow, not throughout. But here's the thing I'm talking about. An ecologist would define a plant as being successful in the landscape different than a horticulturist would. A horticulturist plants a plant, and it grows and looks healthy, and it flowers, and that's success. Not enough for an ecologist. An ecologist wants that plant to proliferate in the landscape. If the individual lives, that's not good enough. It needs to increase in numbers. And if a plant is in the habitat from which it is derived, from which it naturally occurs, not only does it have a better chance of surviving, being competitive out in 40 acres where you're not weeding it, but it will proliferate. It will produce, in all likelihood, produce more viable seeds, and those seeds are more likely to germinate and be able to withstand the competition of other plants that may be ahead of it, both desirable and undesirable. And so here you see that expanding patch of Indian paintbrush, and now you can see in the center there's a Baptisia australis, was not planted there, that was planted elsewhere in that meadow landscape. And so plants are now moving around. And this is one of the keys. The first key is get it in the right place. Not just sunshade, wet, dry. What kind of habitat does it grow? Now, you see on the opposite side of that little window gap is where this meadow was planted. And on the side closer to us, there was no meadow planted. The meadow is expanding into the open woodland gaps that are adjacent and near to it. And again, for lack of time, I'm not going to go into it, but I can sit here and show you probably 15, 18 different species that are now occurring in the sunny gaps adjacent to that meadow where nothing was planted. But it's not just about ecology and science and understanding plants. We're still artists, and we still need to think spatially and how people experience the landscape. And in this case, that sitting area was obviously placed there because there was a spectacular view of the Litchfield Hills in Connecticut. But that swath of Indian grass was planted to basically mirror the angular slopes that you see beyond, and to underline the view out to those. So that wasn't an ecological decision, it was an artistic decision. So let's talk about a few of the ecological processes or characteristics, terms that scientists use more than horticulturists. And whether you use these terms or not, it maybe doesn't matter, but thinking in these terms I think is very important. And one of them is disturbance. Here's a place in New York, Bedford, New York, and this was turf. And there was quite a bit of moss trying to establish in the turf. So the idea here was to turn it into moss, and we went through a process in order to do that. However, one of the things that would have arrested the process in getting rid of the turf or planting even those, all right, let's even look at planting. You'll notice, let me make sure I get the right button for the laser pointer, which I should know. Well, anyway, you see at the bottom center, there's a little bed, there's a little TRL, a few things planted. It's kind of new. It was very important that when they dug those holes for those plants, they didn't throw soil off to the side and then put the soil back in the hole, because that would have loosened soil that might have been left, or any kind of disturbance there would have inhibited the moss, which was what we were trying to grow. So any plant that was planted in that moss area had to be, the soil had to be put on a little piece of burlap and then put back in the hole, so there was no covering up of existing moss. Disturbance. But really the reason I wanted to show this is to go up on top of that rock outcrop. Here we're on top of that outcrop, and then there's another one on beyond it. So this is a little flat area between two rock outcrops. And what you're seeing in there is moss, Mayanthemum, and Pennsylvania sedge, a perfect composition in a dry, ledgy woodland situation. It's there. Nobody planted it. Nobody is maintaining it. I don't think the client was even aware that anything good was up there. Now you can say, oh boy, that's just naturally occurring. This is a beautiful property. They must have really nice woods. They don't. The property was, we got rid of a lot of it, but the property was inundated with invasive plants. And they weren't there. Why? because all of the logging and all of the agriculture and all of the grazing that likely occurred historically on that property didn't occur in that little spot because it was wedged between two rock ledges. Nobody did anything there. That was likely never disturbed. And we're talking serious invasives on that property. Will they never invade that? I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't guarantee it. But they haven't so far. And keeping them out of there would be very easy if you were keeping an eye on it and not letting anything get started. So the point is here, again, we think about what we're going to plant and, strategies for maintaining and everything. But the first question is, to go back to what Todd mentioned in the very beginning, do no harm. It would be very easy to say, oh, even if you recognize this was cool, oh, look at the manthan, look at the moss, this is really nice. Let's go in and enhance it with site-adapted native species that would be the perfect plants, could be native, growing on a ledge in Bedford, New York. The right decisions for plants, and go in and dig a bunch of holes and create a bunch of disturbance. And the next thing you know, there's the Japanese knotweed. Well, not that one. It grows from roots more than seeds. But all of a sudden, there's invasive plants coming in here, and you were trying to do the right thing in the right way. So, understanding disturbance. You go in and disturb a situation. You're removing the competition on the above ground level, but probably more important, you're exposing soil, you're disturbing soil, and you're creating an open seed bed for something to come in that couldn't come in before. Really look at what you've got before you start, and let that influence, when necessary, what you do. So here's the very beginnings of a meadow seeding. And it's bare soil and tiny little seedlings coming in. And this was planted with a Truax drill seeder, which is a big, clunky machine that cuts little furrows and drops seed in the furrow and closes it up with a wheel afterwards. And if you look, it's pulled by a big tractor. And you could say, this is not something that's precise. This is a precise use / avoidance. This is a precise use and avoidance of disturbance. What do I mean by that? Well, where you disturb soil, you will get a higher rate of seed germination. So, if I went in there and tilled the whole thing up and then planted seed over it, I would have a very high rate of seed germination. That's good, I'm planting seeds. But there's also seeds in the soil bank, and they're likely to be highly, there's a lot of weeds present. So I've disturbed everything, and everything's coming in, and it's kind of a crapshoot who wins. In this case, I am only disturbing the soil. Now, there has been disturbance by removal of what was existing there, so the above-ground disturbance has occurred, but the soil disturbance has not. And I am only disturbing in a narrow little trough that the seed is getting deposited, and I'm avoiding soil disturbance in between, where there's nothing but existing seeds, which are probably mostly weeds. So this big clunky machine is actually being very precise to use and avoid disturbance in one process. And it's not an accident that the weed presence is reduced and more easy. There's never no weeds, there's never no maintenance. Anybody that says that, be skeptical right away. However, it's vastly reduced, and that is one of the methods that would have been used to stack the deck in favor of the species that we want to end up dominating, as in the ones we planted. And the other thing I'll say about this meadow is it was a very poor soil, and everyone involved was advocating bringing in some topsoil, tilling in some compost, doing something to make it better. All that would have done was increase the weed presence. We didn't need any of that because we're picking the plants that were adapted to that soil condition. They don't need fertilizer, they don't need compost, they don't need nothing. This is the soil they grow in. So all we're doing is increasing the weed presence by doing all those good horticultural things. And here's some of them at hawkweed and liatris and Allium cernum, and a different species of liatris in a wet pocket, and mountain mints, and veronicastrum, and queen of the prairie, which was planted in live plants because you can't get seed of it or it doesn't grow, and upland ironweed, that yellowish seed head, which is a terrific, not the New York ironweed, which is a great plant too, but is a huge native species that grows primarily in wetter areas, and this is a dry upland one. It's a great garden plant. Nobody ever uses it, and it's really hard to find. Rattlesnake master, In the fall, little blue stem with fringe Jensen coming in. So that was a really bad soil. Again, we were advised to do a lot of manipulation of the soil to improve it, which would have made the meadow not as diverse. No question in my mind. Succession. What do I mean by succession? Here's a front lawn of this cottage, also in Connecticut. And, excuse me, you see little blue stem and mountain mint. They're the primary plants that you're seeing evident floral and in foliage at this point of the year. But that isn't what showed up right after planting. So I want to look at succession, which is the process of change, vegetative change that occurs over time in a natural landscape, and how we can utilize it in how we think about selecting plants for the landscape. So here's like an earlier stage of it, and you're looking at a grass called Hortium jubatum, or barley oats grass. This is a fast-growing, very beautiful grass, that low, beautiful grass that establishes very quickly, but it's short-lived and non-competitive. So the idea here is this is a plant that will be a dominant plant in the early stages and give way to the slower-growing, longer-lived species coming down the road, such as this. Now let's go back and look at the process again. So here we are. Where's the Hortium jubatum? It's gone. It's been replaced by little blue stem in the grass part of this matrix. However, I want to kind of go through the process and relate it to a very small-scale garden design, so to speak. Here on the right, you can see there's a pine tree, and there's a swath of purple coneflower that was planted. Kind of lead your eye up the little path to the back door of the cottage. So that's fine, and that swath, much of this was planted in seed. That swath was planted in live plants because I wanted it to be there and be reliably showing the pattern that I wanted. But let's go back in time. So now you can see the pine tree. We're now looking at the center of it. And in the background, you're seeing black-eyed Susan, which is where the coneflower was in the picture you saw before. And in the foreground is Hortium jubatum, the barley oats grass. And here it is. The Hortium jubatum has been overtaken by the mountain mint that was planted from seed, and the black-eyed Susan, which is a biennial. It's only going to live for 2 years. Leaves first year, flower second year, now it's dead. Is taken over by coneflower. And if you would have walked over to that Rudbeckia and parted the foliage, you would have seen little coneflower plants underneath it that were slower growing and took over. What happened to the Rudbeckia? Well, it's obvious it died because it's a biennial, but how come the seeds, it produced millions of seeds probably dropping there? Well, when it was planted, it was open soil and things were germinating because we had open situation. Now the seeds are underneath 4 feet of dense vegetation and they're sitting there viable but not germinating. And where will you get black-eyed Susan? Little gaps here and there. It still will be present, but only in gaps where there may be a disturbance. But the majority of the landscape is covered by the more longer-lived, more aggressive perennial species. That picture snuck in here. It has nothing to do with this. I apologize, other than it's Hortium. Literally, you know, cut and paste is really easy, but sometimes you screw up. And so if you were coming up the driveway, there's the swath of coneflower that you would be looking over. Again, there's ecology there, there's succession. I understood that Rudbeckia hirta is a precursor, one of the species, that would be a precursor to the longer-lived perennials such as Echinacea. So if I really don't want to belabor it, but if I went back to that image, go past the one I didn't even want, what would have been the way to get there, traditionally horticulture? Say, oh, I want to plant a native plant, I want to plant Echinacea purpurea, nothing wrong there. You would have taken the plugs that those Echinacea were planted in that swath, and you would have planted them exact spacing that we did, except instead of the seed of Rudbeckia being the early stage colonizer, you would have mulched it. And you would have little plugs in a bed of mulch. And you would have had to weed the mulch much more than you would have to weed 24 or 30 inches of Rudbeckia, because that's a much thicker, denser weed suppression than an inch or 2 of mulch. So you would have been, for a number of years until the Echinacea did what you were looking for it to do, and it would have, you would have weeded the mulch, you would have been buying mulch. The mulch would have had no ecological value or aesthetic value, as opposed to Rudbeckia hirta, which has all of the above in that interim. So that's applicable. This is succession that's applicable on a garden bed the size of this stage. You know, this does not mean that this stuff only matters if you're dealing with big places. So let's just travel down to the lake on the path, and just as in any good garden designer would, I'm manipulating when and how much of the lake you see as you travel down the path, where it's partially obscured, and then you get a view of the dock as you're traveling, and you can see the pink milkweed. And now this is a whole different plant composition, because this is down by the lake where water is wicking and it's wet. However, even though it's the same plant, it's a different plant composition because it's a different habitat type, the idea of succession is the same, because the Verbena hastata that you see there, the blue flower, is a biennial, and it's serving the same purpose that Rudbeckia hirta did in the upland landscape. It's a dominant player in the early stages, intended to give way to the slower-growing, longer-lived species like Joe Pye weed and white turtlehead and the other things that you would see in there. So again, this idea of using succession in a seed mix, all of these seeds are planted at the same time, but they have different rates of growth. They are occupying different niches in time in the development of this meadow over years. And that's understood way at the beginning when you're putting together a seed mix. Now, meadow in a can, that I'm sure you all know was not a great path to take in the horticulture world. Lots of flowers the first year, and then it's gone the second year. You could go the opposite direction and make the same mistake. Say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to use site-adapted native plants that are long-lived perennials that are going to stick around for hundreds of years like they did in the prairies. And that's a mistake, and that's all I'm going to use. Why? Because those plants take a long time to develop. And the short-lived species that would occupy it right away and suppress many or most of the invasive species that you want to not end up dominating this thing would be absent. And so you would have an invasion of unwanted plants in all likelihood in the early stages that possibly might outcompete the perennials that are coming along slowly. So now there's a little niche that you come to, a little sitting niche, and that's the first time you get the big open view of the lake, and my angle wasn't wide enough to get anywhere near it, but you get the idea. But I wanted to look at this composition right here again. I found it. Let's look at this. What's going on here? What's the trajectory? You're looking at a mix of the short-lived and long-lived species. We've got Rudbeckia hirta. That's going to fade out. We've got Monarda didyma. That's an aggressive, long-lived perennial. That's is in ascendance. This is in descendance. Mountain mint, Pycnathum muticum, ascendance. Daisy fleabane, another short-lived species, wasn't even planted. You could say, I hate it, should I weed it, or I love it. It doesn't matter. It's not going to stay. It's a short-lived species. You can love it, you can hate it, it's going away. Oxeye sunflower, which is right here, looks like, no, they're in there. The ones that have the lighter center is Oxeye sunflower mixed with the Rudbeckia, and those are long-term players. And there you go. Oxeye sunflower, Monarda didyma. I think the mountain mint is up in here, not blooming at the moment. And so you can see the Rudbeckia hirta. What happened to the Rudbeckia hirta? What happened to the Daisy fleabane? They're gone. And that's predictable. You could have walked up to that, knew nothing about it, looked at it and say, here's where this is going. And that's just a picture that's an excuse to show an accidental, beautiful color combination with the boats and the plants. I didn't engineer it, but I like it. So let's look at shrubs and succession. The shrub stage generally is after the herbaceous meadow. So the idea here is this is Aesculus parviflora shrub thicket, 100%. But right now there's perennials in there, mostly from seed, some from live plants. The intent here is the perennials are temporary to be overtaken by the shrubs, which are a later stage of succession, so that'll happen without any help. And here you see, over time, the perennials served their purpose and their last little vestige hanging on in there, and now it's a shrub thicket. So we're using the herbaceous stage as a precursor to the shrub stage. And here we're using the herbaceous meadow stage as a precursor to woods. Because today, when you look at that picture, it's sunny. and that's a sunny meadow, but it ain't going to stay sunny. So the species that were planted in that particular meadow, the short-lived species, are the exact same short-lived species that would have been planted in a meadow that was open sun and would remain so. But the long-term species are woodland edge species, because when we get to that stage, we're going to start getting shaded, and it's going to be a different composition. So the day everything was planted, it all looked the same from the meadows, but you go there a number of years later when the shade canopy there's a different composition on the herbaceous layer. And again, I won't go into it, but here you see what's called an old field, and it's a mixture of the two, little blue stem, red cedar, all planted, and a tree grove, a little woodland patch planted. Why? Unfortunately, these folks, from their house, they saw that driveway as the dividing property line, and they had a beautiful meadow that we had planted that they obviously wanted, but the way their house was facing, they looked at this lawn of their neighbor more than their own meadow. So the woodland was planted there for habitat and for all the things you'd want in woods, and to screen that lawn. They ended up getting divorced. She got the property. She didn't want to mow it anymore. She stopped mowing, and it turned into Indian grass because it was next door to the Indian grass meadow that we had planted, which was very interesting. She didn't plant it. And there you see our screen planting, habitat planting, woodland grove, call it whatever you want. This is the edge of the woods on the same property. You can see the existing trees had vines, bittersweet, mostly some grape growing all the way up. That was all removed. Some of the trees were dead, they were removed. So, okay, you did that, but those edges where there's a lot of sun, but you're not cutting it like you are mowing it if it's a field or grazed or a meadow, are places where the invasive species are really kind of dominating. And the idea here was to get the sunlight, block the sunlight with low branch, dense plants so that those species don't just keep coming back. And I'll reverse succession, shrub thicket in upstate New York of a nice plant, gray dogwood. About 7 acres of gray dogwood. Client wants more of a meadow grassland. Looking at it, I could see that there was remnants of little blue stem, and that's probably what was the dominant plant going back in time, and we want to go back to that. We could have killed all the shrubs and planted little blue stem. Instead, we marked where we wanted to leave some of the gray dogwood to remain because it's desirable, and then we're brush hogging the rest at multiple times only in the spring. Why? Because the shrub grows primarily in the spring, and the native little blue stem that we're managing for doesn't grow at all in the spring. It starts in the summer, in the hot weather. So if you mow all spring, you're cutting the gray dogwood and wasting its resources. Then you stop mowing at the end of spring. It doesn't come back much because that's not its period, but the little blue stem just comes up, never was cut, and over a number of years, not that many, it turns into little blue stem. You can see it starting to come in now. You can see an island that was left of gray dogwood, and that's the eventual composition there. Before picture of a little niche where there was a nice white dogwood, and here we left the gray dogwood into a circle and a little entry, and this is a little area that you would look into from the main path, and there it is once that mowing process had its desired effect. And here is the path. Goes up through the middle of it, and you can see little blue stem and gray dogwood. And I will end it with this, and I'll just go through it. Jan made a really good point. This isn't about extirpating other design styles, extirpating non-native plants, regardless of their ecological tendencies. There's lots of ways to go at this. So I would just like to show you some images of what I would call a formal native design. That looks like another meadow. What are you talking about? Not really. Tradescantia, Baptisia, formal path, highbush blueberry, and a perfectly oval lawn panel. 3 sides of this is a formal planting, and then it kind of degenerates, I shouldn't use that word, degenerates into a 7-acre meadow. There it is looking back at the path from the meadow into the formal native garden. Here you are. Where are you now, man? Well, you're on that formal path. Doesn't look like it. There's only certain places where you get the formality as you're traveling through this. There. Now you're out in the wild meadow. You can't, this is Zizia aureus in the spring. Looking back at the house, wow, you know, this is the wild place. And you're coming back to the formal garden, and there you are. back of the formal hedgerow. On each corner was big blue stem. I didn't mention that. And if you walk a little bit up here and look into there, there's one high bush blueberry that was just kind of inserted in the grass that you would never see unless you just walked by it. The wild one, as opposed to the formal hedgerow that was right across the way. And so I'll end it here. What is this? This, you're looking at a composition. Every single plant in there is part of a formal garden composition. Yet the only time that you see it as a formal garden composition is when you're in it. We're just about to enter and approach it. So that's garden design, it's ecology, and I'll end it with this thought. Those blueberries on the left, those red leaf blueberries, that's part of a hedgerow. Doesn't look like it here, but it is. Do you think the birds flying over this property care whether those blueberries are in a straight line hedgerow or scattered through the landscape? I don't think so. So with that, I'll hand it over to our next speaker. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here again. I just love the title of this event, of this gathering, Cultivating a New Garden Ethic. I love the ambition, and I love the vision, and love that I'm in a room of doers and solutions people like you. So Susan and I have 3 stories to tell today, and they're going to start with where our ethic comes from, our gardening ethic and our broader-based land ethic. And then we'll go into 2 stories of how we've tried to make that ethic real, how we try to live it.
So in my family, the idea of caring for the land goes back to 1935 when my grandfather, Aldo Leopold, bought 80 acres of a derelict farm in central Wisconsin. That's Aldo with his back to us. When he came home and told my aunts and uncles that he had bought this property, my aunt, who's on the right, Nina, later told me that she imagined this little farmhouse with a white picket fence and red geraniums. And on that cold, drizzly winter day when they went to see the farm for the first time, they were pretty dismayed to see that the farmhouse had burned. The only structure on the property was this chicken coop. And it had 3 feet of frozen chicken manure in it. They had to take an ice pick to get it out. You can see the pile of chicken manure on the side. And that's what they called the shack. My father was in high school at the time, and he took a photography class, which is really lucky because we have good documentation of the early days at the shack. In this panorama, he had climbed a tree by the road and had taken a picture back towards the property. And as you can see, it's an eroded, barren property. The former owners had cut most of the trees. They had dug up the prairie and planted corn. But the sand is soil, the soil is sandy, and the Dust Bowl came, the crops failed, and the farmer left. And that's when my grandfather bought the property for back taxes. I think it was $8 an acre. But the family quickly got into the spirit of being there and working the land. The first year they planted 3,000 pines. They planted native shrubs. And the area that used to be the prairie, they collected local prairie seeds and planted those. But the first year, all 3,000 trees, pines, died. But every year they kept planting trees, and the trees grew. They went out every weekend as a family, almost every weekend as a family, and often brought friends. And everybody really loved going out there and working on the property. It was very sociable, and they just felt that they had invested in something. This is the first attempt at what we now call ecological restoration. Here is the Leopold family. So there's my grandfather and grandmother, 4 of my aunts and uncles, and my dad took the picture, and their dog, Flicka. Here they are at the shack. All of the children were greatly influenced by the years of growing up working at the shack. Later, when I asked them about this time, they said that this was had a huge influence on their lives. It had a huge influence on how they thought about working with the land and also all of their careers. My Aunt Nina, I think, summed it up really well with the quote, "The shack was nothing, but it was everything." Here Aldo is at the shack writing in his journal. He kept meticulous records about what they were doing, but more importantly, he was thinking and writing about why they were doing it. It's here that he was formulating his ideas for writing the essays that later he put down in the book, A Sand County Almanac. It's here where he talked about what he called the land ethic. The land ethic is something that land is not a commodity that we can use for our own benefit, but it's something that we should nurture and benefit the way we would somebody that we loved, another person or an animal. Here's the book, A Sand County Almanac. Some people have called it the Bible of the conservation movement. It's sold over 2 million copies and has been translated into 13 different languages. Here's the shack today. So you can see they added on a little bit and they put bunk beds in there. They have a fireplace, no electricity. There's a hand pump for water and an outhouse called the Parthenon. It's on the National Historic Registry, and it's probably the most famous chicken coop in North America. This is what the pines look like today. And a really cool story, my father helped plant these pines when he was in high school, and then in the 80s when they were doing a thinning, he actually took the logs from the thinning and built the house that he lived in for the rest of his life. So now we move on. So that's my family's legacy. And now as an adult, Scott and I wanted to think about what we could do to carry this legacy forward. We lived in Seattle. We had a house. It's in an urban area with a grassy lawn. Our boys played on the lawn, but we wanted to do something different with our yard. It happened at that time that I read a book. I was reading a book, Animal Vegetable Miracle. How many of you have read that book? So it's a book that Barbara Kingsolver wrote about growing local food, and she had a year where she only bought food that was produced within 100 miles of her house. And I was so inspired by this book, and I remember so well lying in bed and turning to Scott and saying, I know what we're going to do with our yard. Let's build, tear it up and we'll build a garden. We'll call it a world garden. So we brought in an excavator.
It's always helpful to have a neighbor with a backhoe.
And we took out the yucky soil and built terraces and planted vegetables and flowers. This was very inspiring. We were really excited. It was really amazing to grow your own food in your own yard. We had a vegetable garden before, but it was a small garden. And so now this is our whole front yard. And we were lucky to have southern exposure, and so that was really helpful. But so we could have vegetables grown there, no transportation costs. We had fresh food. We had the satisfaction of getting our hands in the dirt and watching things grow. So now we can freeze and dry things all summer long that we eat all winter long. So the influence of this garden goes beyond just our property and our house. Our yard was written up in the Seattle Times by Valerie Easton, who is a prominent garden writer in the Northwest. She was writing about the local movement, the movement to grow local food. I also teach piano, and my piano students just love our yard. We also have bees, and there's quite a few of them who have begged their parents to have the garden in their own yard, and they've started gardens, vegetable gardens in their yard. And in our neighborhood also, people have started to grow vegetables in their front yard. We get a lot of really, it's fun having it in our front yard, because when we're out there working and people are walking by, they always stop and say, oh, we just love walking past your garden. We always try to walk past it. What are you growing now? Or we have this plant, you know, how do you grow this vegetable? So it's had a wider influence than just for us. And this harkens back to the days of the Victory Garden in World War II.
And if you haven't had a chance yet, spend some time with the photographs out in the lobby, in the auditorium, what NYBG is doing and has done with the community gardens in the local neighborhood in the Bronx is just really fantastic. Just this our little effort many times over. So great place to be. So now we did do that sort of local implementation of our garden ethic and land ethic from Susan's family. We had always dreamed about working on a larger project. And in 2004, we found one. So just to get you oriented, this is Washington State, the Pacific Ocean. This is the Olympic Peninsula that juts out just west of Seattle, where we still live. And the project we found, or that found us, is called Tarbu Creek. So this is the watershed that's outlined here. This is the Pacific inlet of the Pacific Ocean, and it's a little tiny salmon stream. It runs about 7 miles to the north. And this is a view of the watershed looking down toward the Pacific. So the creek is running through this floodplain right here. The old growth forest had been logged off here probably in the 1880s, 1890s, all gone certainly by 1900. And the area had been farmed. The floodplain was mostly pasture for dairy farms, but the soils are very poor, and the commercial farming had basically stopped by the 1960s, and this land was just abandoned for commercial purposes. But there'd been a lot of damage to the creek. If you see these straight lines, those are ditches. So most of the creek and the floodplains had been severely degraded from an ecological standpoint, and again, no longer serving a commercial function. So this is what it looked like when the project started. These photos are actually from the first day we set foot on the land we ended up buying. Little 18 acres was our initial venture. And you can see the water just racing through the creek here. It was just running like a fire hose down this ditch. And a friend of ours, this is Sue Davenport, she actually climbed down in the ditch, and she and the creek were 6 feet under. So the habitat had been severely degraded for salmon. And some of you will recognize some of your favorite invasives, like Himalayan blackberry and reed canary grass. It was it was a complete mess. But fortunately for us, one of the things that attracted us to this project is that a little community had started to form to work on the watershed as a whole, and we were one of the first pieces to fall into place. So a conservation group from the area, led by this guy right here, Peter Bales, had a little grant to bring in an excavator. This is run by a guy named Bob Harrison, and he started taking the ditch back and to put the creek back in a natural, flowing, meandering path. So Bob would start to scrape out a channel, and then he'd often get the contour he wanted by putting an I-beam in the bucket and scraping. And Susan, I remember her standing there she is with her arms akimbo right behind Peter Bales, and she'd say, and Susan's also an artist, and she'd say, if I put a brush in that bucket, he could paint a picture. He was really good.
He was amazing.
He makes his living digging basements 9 months of the year on an excavator, but he's a salmon fisherman, so he's the go-to guy for stream restorations in Western Washington. Real character. So he'd get the basic sculpture of the new meanders, and then he'd pick up logs we'd scavenged from old logging sites or trees that had been dropped but were too damaged for the mill, and he'd rumble over. We'd hear him coming toward us where we were working on an excavator. He'd bring a log in, drop it where he wanted it, and then we'd hear this, "Hoo-wee! The fish will love that!" Like, and he smoked the entire time, so those hoo-wees would come out with his cigarette in his hand. And then we would come in, we had family and friends out there. Any idea what we're doing here? Have any of you worked on streams? Say again?
Live stakes.
Yeah, we're doing live stakes. These are willow stakes that would actually cut off the property, and we're pounding those in. Why are we pounding those in? Yeah, we have Coir Manning here so this is the actual creek channel that Bob is just, and we've put down grass seed and hay and straw for erosion control. And so the stream bed itself will be running over the coir to keep it stable. And so the live stakes, the willow stakes will keep the coir in place, and then they'll sprout. Because the biggest thing you want over a fish-bearing stream is shade. Keep the water cool. And then Bob would rumble back after the coir was in place and the willow stakes are in and drop. What's he doing here? He's putting gravel in. Why is that? Yeah, salmon lay their eggs in gravel. Yep. The first year, when it was in the ditch on this little parcel, there was only about 1,000 feet of creek. After the remeander, there was over 1,500. It was a 50% increase in the habitat. And we had 0 salmon nests before and 13 the first salmon run after the creek was done. So this is what the meanders looked like when it was out of the ditch, with the woody debris there and the gravel in place. And then when we channeled the water back in, Susan and I have written a book about this project, and I think the line I used was, watching the water go back into the new channel was like watching an innocent man who'd been exonerated walk out of prison after 35 years. And this was a wonderful thing. This is Susan's dad, Carl Leopold, who planted those trees she just showed you. And one of the great joys of our life is that he lived long enough to see this project. His kids, our boys, his grandkids, are the 4th generation of Leopolds to do this kind of work. So just after the restoration, this is Gene Jones, who's an elder and spiritual leader from the Suquamish Nation, singing welcome song at the ceremony to dedicate the new creek, with a lot of people who helped make it responsible. And a couple weeks after that, a couple hundred school kids with their moms and dads showed up to do what's now become the annual plant-a-thon along Tarbu Creek. And this January will be the 15th year. The first one was 14th year. First one was in January 2005. The gang planted 3,000 trees that first, with the plant protectors, that first Saturday. And these little guys, I should tell you a quick story. This time of year, it's almost exactly this time of year, my nephew and I were at a local high school in one of the villages nearby for a holiday gift fair. And there was a plant-a-thon table. So there were 2 high school boys selling plant-a-thon tickets. So these planting days are a fundraiser for the local schools. And they'll sell a ticket, and so I bought a couple for holiday presents. And they'll say, well, we'll plant a tree in memory of a pet or a loved one or a friend you just reconnected with and want to celebrate. And we'll plant a tree in Tarbu Watershed in January. And so I bought a couple to give away for the holidays. And then as I was turning away, I turned to the 2 boys and I said, this probably doesn't mean anything to you, but actually we own the place where the first plant-a-thon occurred in 2005. And they both jumped up and lit up and said, we were there, we planted trees, we go back, they're 40 feet high now. They were just thrilled. So the trees did grow, and Carl did lived to see them. He died not long after this photo was taken, though, actually, and we were able to buy adjacent woodland that we now call Carl's Forest. It's about 160 acres, some older trees like you're seeing right here, and then some younger forests that we're actively managing with pruning and thinning operations to try to restore a really diverse forest for the future. But we call it Carl's Forest, and it was a memorial to Susan's dad, but it is not a museum, it's a working forest, and we've actually felled the first trees off the place about 1.5 years ago, and we donated the wood to a new biology building at the University of Washington. And we actually dropped some of these really precious bigger trees, about 115 years old. And it was wonderful. They took, a friend of ours runs a mill, and he took the center cores out of each of these big trees. And the biology building, the new building is 6 stories high. And it has a glass wall, and next to the elevators, these tree trunks are installed, 8 of them side by side, and you start at in the ground floor where the butt of the tree was, and then you go up, each floor is the tree as it goes up, and you see it from the glass floor to the outside. So it's a wonderful project the community will enjoy for a long time. So now we're 14, 15 years into this endeavor, and you see no more straight lines at Tarbu Creek, the remeandering. The kids and their families in these 4 or 5 different schools who've participated over the years have reforested this entire floodplain, and wildlife is coming back. Who is that? You recognize, look at this date. That was less than 2 months ago. And then a week after, this was a neighbor just across the road sent us this, and then Susan was out with my sister, and they found this. I've worked on a grizzly bear study in Yellowstone Park, and so I know a little bit about bears, but I've never seen anything like this. This was I knew a black bear had been digging. Probably this guy, she probably did it right here. Any idea, this is a close-up, any idea what's going on there? Any gardeners in here who've had trouble with, had hosted ground wasps? The bear was digging a ground wasp nest.
I didn't realize, too, that the ground wasps build actually like a paper nest underneath the ground. You can see the paper nest, and you can see that the wasps were pretty upset, but they were carrying the couple little larvae they had left. You could just watch them take it and try to mend it.
That was an expensive lunch for that black bear. Man, it got stung a few times. Who's that? That, again, was just taken about 2 months ago. There was no we never saw cougars in the area until this restoration area started. Now we see their sign regularly. Enough. We don't walk alone outside at night. If we do a lot of singing. Do you recognize this guy? Anybody? Yeah, it's a bobcat. Yep. So the native cats are back. But the story is really all about the salmon returning. There were relic populations, and I said you always have up and down years with salmon. These are chum salmon that are just fresh from the Pacific, coming back to look for a place to lay eggs and start the next generation. We've had a really dry November. We just had our first really big storm 2 days ago. And so the creek has been coming up. We haven't checked the flow. We can check the flow rate on the internet, but the fish are probably running as we speak. They wait out in the ocean until the first rains come in the fall, and then when the creek comes up, they come rushing up and do their nesting. So we're still out there every weekend planting trees or controlling invasives or doing whatever, building paths, whatever needs to be done, working in the woods. And Susie's always amazed. Our friends are always asking us, when can we come out and help? Like, when can we go out in the 40 degrees spitting rain, get all muddy and wet, and help? I think we've counted 80 friends.
That's kind of the most amazing thing about this project is that people want to come out, and they love to come out and work.
We've counted, I think, 80 friends and family in our immediate circle, and over 1,000 school kids and their moms and dads have planted trees in this watershed, and they're out in January when the weather's absolutely miserable. Something about doing this work really touches people at the heart. It provides something that we're not getting somewhere else. And that really brings me to this is my favorite quote from Susan's grandfather's writing. It's actually not from Sand County Almanac, it's from a different essay, but he declared, there are two things that interest me, the relation of people to each other and the relation of people to the land. And that's the heart of what we are trying to do in a small way in our corner of the planet, is to build those two relationships. Because if there's one thing we found, and as Susan mentioned with our little neighborhood community enjoying our garden and doing some of their own gardening, is that when we do this type of work together and we build this relationship to the land, we build a relationship with each other. Like, look at the photos of those community gardens out there. Those are people who've learned to love each other because they have something in common. And that's why we call it a world garden, a global garden. You're doing something not just for yourself, you're doing something for the planet and everyone who's with us. So thank you very much.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and a mic will come to you.
Thank you all. It was wonderful. Beautiful presentation. I'm Carol Capobianco, Director of the Native Plant Center. I'd like to know from Plant Right, are you coming east at all? And also, how are you funded?
Yes. Thank you for the question. First, I'll answer the funding question. We have been funded through Sustainable Conservation's general operating costs, so primarily through individual and family foundation grants. Our work on the pre-tool, we did get funding through the Farm Bill not too long ago to expand beyond California. And as far as are we coming east, We would love to share our knowledge, our framework in any way we can. But I'm sad to say that we don't have a plan to go beyond California, but we would love to support other states in doing so. I know that Plant Pony in Hawaii, North Carolina, Texas, we've done some collaboration with, and we just created a video that talks about starting a Plant Right program. So I invite you to check that out, and happy to field any questions later.
So the message is grow your own.
Grow your own, exactly.
So thank you, and a question for Larry. When you were talking about the meadow and you talked about your machine that seeded it, can you tell us what you removed and how you removed it, that part of the...
You mean the existing vegetation
Right.
that was there?
Right.
In that case, it was sprayed with herbicide to get it to the point where seeds would germinate, to remove the competition. It's about a 40-acre field. We do many projects that way, and we do quite a few projects organically where no herbicide is used, and there's various reasons why. I didn't get into this because I love the smell of herbicide in the morning, so any opportunity I have to be able to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish without it, I'm going to do that. And I also welcome the opportunity to do it without any chemicals, regardless of the challenges of it, because that's tricky stuff, but I think doable. It requires a lot of thinking. It's kind of, you got two groups of plants that you want to enhance and hold back, and you got to really understand their proclivities and put in place various strategies that all added up end up pushing it the way you want to go. And if you don't get the opportunity to ever do it, you're never going to learn how to do it, so to speak. So
There's a question in the back row, middle section, last seat in.
This is also a question for Larry. You talked about no disturbance, but you are going to get weeds after you've planted. So how do you cope with that? Do you cut? Do you pull? Do you, how do you deal with that? Or do you just hope that the good plants will outcompete the weeds?
the hope strategy generally doesn't work. I'm a good hoper, and I'm optimistic, but it doesn't work. Yeah, I mean, it's a multi-pronged approach that's different with every single project. Some of the things that run through all of them would be the first year after seeding, the meadow is mowed at approximately 6 inches, as much as monthly or every 6 weeks during that first growing season. None of the seedlings that we would have planted would be above 6 inches, and weed seeds in the soil could very well be. So you're cutting over the tops. That's a big strategy in the very early stages, because people think about the bittersweets and the multiflora roses and some of these really nasty, aggressive, woody weeds. But if you have removed them before you started, they're not the ones that come back by the millions right away. They come back here and there, and if you ignore them, they will Shanghai the whole process. But if you don't, if you get them in the beginning, they can be dealt with individually. What comes in by the millions are the annual and biennial weeds that long-term can't compete with the stronger meadow perennial species, but if those species haven't germinated yet, they can just cover the whole thing and shut it down. So that mowing process is keeping light to the seedlings. It's also preventing the majority of the weeds that are likely to be there that are early stage biennial and annual species that are relying on seed formation to continue. As part of the system, you're cutting off the seed production too. So it's kind of a multi-pronged strategy. And there are a number of other things, that we would be doing. But one of the last things, or things that we would avoid, would be pulling weeds. I would rather cut a weed. In most cases, once I have a dense composition of aggressive, desirable species, I would rather reach down there and cut the plant that I don't want than pull it by the roots. Pulling it by the roots creates a soil disturbance, which generates seed germination, and the seed bank in the early stages of these are dominated by weedy species. So all you're doing is pulling a weed to create 10 more weeds, and then coming back and pulling them. So spot application, meaning either painting directly on the foliage and herbicide or just cutting, would be the way we would spot deal with, and then mow it once a year at the end of the season after that first year of more frequent mowing. And there's other things I could talk for a long time, but the key is it's really understanding the specific weeds that you are trying to deal with, and deal with them with a specific strategy, not just run around and broadcast stuff all over the place or mow it willy-nilly. Everything is an analytical process, both before you start as well as ascertaining things that may be occurring that were not what you expected, and have a toolbox to be able to deal with those. But it's all individual stuff. What you do for that weed is not what you do for that weed.
This question is for Larry as well. Over here.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I'm a designer, and I'm wondering, when you speak to potential clients about these ecological processes and the sort of level of care that's going to go into them, do they just take your word for it, or do you need to sometimes illustrate it graphically, or what sort of tools do you use to get people on board?
Yeah, I do illustrate it graphically, and I do talk about why. And if actually you looked at if someone wants me to provide them with a proposal to create a design, whether it's for a meadow or a whole landscape, obviously a proposal is going to say, oh, here's the deliverables, and here's the scope of work, and here's what it costs, and all the things that go into the proposal. However, we include rationales for why we do things in that. If we are going to provide this service, here is why. And I think, and it's very logical. It's not just, how are we going to deal with, obviously people are very well aware there's a lot of weeds out there. And you're talking about even an acre, that's a big garden. Maybe you think of it as a small meadow. 10,000 square feet is a big garden. So the point is that I am, whether it's verbally in discussion or in our proposal that we provide, before we've gotten into a design, I'm talking about here's why these things work. Here's what we're doing to make it happen. Here's not pictures of a 1, 2, 3-year-old meadow. Here's a picture of the meadow first year, second, 5th year, 12th, 15th year. But to be honest with you, because this is what I do and I'm fairly well known for it, the people that come to me already have an inclination to this. And in the early days, was a little bit submissive of comments by other designers saying, I have a hard time getting people to do this and this, that, and the other, and I would think, well, I don't know, why is that? And then when I started getting hired by landscape architects as a sub-consultant, and not people that were coming to me originally, I realized now not everybody is on board with this so much as I think they are. So I have a lot more respect for the difficulties that designers have to explain this stuff to people than I used to. And I have a long track record, so I can show a lot of projects over a lot of years to gain confidence. You need that confidence, because year 1 or 2, some of these meadows not the case. You plant a native plant garden with live plants, it's going to develop similar to any garden, but when you start with seeds and tiny little plugs and over big areas, you need credibility, because there's going to be stages in the beginning where it doesn't look good, and if you don't have confidence, people don't have confidence in you, then their mental state can go south even when the thing is on a perfectly good trajectory.
This actually moves beyond just landscape design. There's a whole movement in the field of ecology called translational ecology. There was an entire journal article dedicated to this last December. And this is something we try to do here at NYBG every day with all of our visitors, the volunteer groups, the school children who come out into the Thane Family Forest. And how do you, all of us who are aware of this in this room are responsible for translating and teaching about ecology and how everything is interconnected. and talking with Jan and her nurserymen, and how they went out and visited the sites that were invaded. So understanding the ecological impacts of what we do every day. So it's a really big picture. So what Larry's doing is great, and we can all take this away and teach somebody about ecology.
I guess it's also for Larry. Since we're talking about a new garden ethic, I'm wondering whether there's ever an ethical decision that comes into play when you're thinking about maintaining a meadow and holding back the natural succession and habitat creation that would occur by itself.
Yeah, well, the last part of your question is really interesting to me, and that is vegetation that would occur either on its own or with certain manipulations, but not necessarily planting it. And I'm finding that to be very interesting, and it's something that's integrated into many of our projects, not every single one, but this idea of we don't have to plant everything. You know, you walk away, you want a forest, do nothing, and you'll have a forest eventually. It may go through some really bad stages that nobody wants to see or live in, understood. However, and we need to deal with that. But the point is, how many trees get sold in this country? How many trees get shipped from Tennessee up to New York through red oak? How many red oaks get shipped from a nursery in Tennessee to New York through acres and acres of red oaks that nobody planted? You know what I mean? But you can't get from here to a red oak forest without buying red oaks and planting them unless you know something about the processes that lead to that and have some ability to affect those processes. Sorry if I missed the beginning of your question. I don't remember it anymore.
I'm going to actually jump in I have a question for Scott and Susan. Either your friends are weird or crazy, or maybe just people out there are different. But one of the great challenges for us is, it's not so much a challenge for NYBG, but it's a challenge for our region, is getting people motivated on a small scale and connected on a small scale to participate in projects that have a large time frame for results. So what did you promise people in the earliest days?
Chili and cookies.
Okay, write that down.
Yeah, the fun has to be in the process. And when we've given talks about the project, people will say, well, when is it going to be done? And our answer is never, and that's the point. So if the process isn't fun, you're not going to get people out there working on the long term. And one advantage in the Pacific Northwest on the wet side of the mountains is that things grow fast, and so those kids are looking at their trees now and thinking, I'm going to do this with my kids. So there is that reward, but like in Larry's gardens, what he's talking about, you were seeing show in 2, 3, 4 years. So I think that it has to be part of the plan too, that there has to be some reward to keep you going.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I was wondering, this is a question for all of you. Like, I've worked a lot in landscapes that are, quite novel ecosystems. Lots of invasives, highly disturbed sites, lots of nourishment everywhere. Anyway, but I notice a lot of bees and wasps and all kinds of insects, for example, visiting the knotweed in the late summer. And the beekeeper's like, great, not a lot else going on this time of year. So what's the harm, Anyway, but I know that weeds are weeds and they kind of crowd out everything else, and having a whole ecosystem based on 3 plants is exactly ideal. But as I try to restore the landscape, one of my questions is, what kinds of ecological services are these plants providing? So when I put in new plants, I'm not only covering the bases taken by, the services provided by the weeds I'm pulling out, but I would like those plants to do that and more, ideally. For example, spicebush berries have a lot of fat in their berries, which make them more valuable than, say, oriental bittersweet, from what I've read. But there's not a lot of information like that, not those deep dives as much as I would like, and I was wondering if any of you have sources you could direct me to either individuals, researchers, books that could help kind of me put together a well-designed plant community.
Yeah, that's your short answer. The best experimental work that I'm aware of is in mainstream ecology, where the general question has been, what's the general relationship between species richness, just plant count per square meter, and different ecosystem service products, like carbon utilization or biomass accumulation or insect diversity or resilience to drought or disturbance. And the general message of those experiments, and this is across the world now, is that basically species richness is good. That the more diversity you have, the more services you're going to be providing. That said, as Larry said, you need to design, so you need to understand your plants. Like if you're doing a meadow situation, you want to know something about root depth and plant that sort of diversity, or in a forest situation, we're always thinking about structure in the forest to plant that sort of diversity, and be mindful of successionary processes, so you're adding the right things at the right time so they can be successful. So I would think about that as that our sort of touchstone is just general diversity of the plant community, and then the idea is that the insects and the black bears and the cougars will follow.
I have actually something to add to that as well. When we started actively restoring the Thane family forest about 20 years ago now, there really wasn't a great roadmap for how to do it. There's ecological restoration literature, but it wasn't very detailed. So we used kind of a little bit of silvicultural training and a little bit of kind of horticultural common sense just to start. And our goal was the natural regeneration of native species, whatever they were. And then over the years, we've kind of backfilled that work with a rationale. It was a little bit instinct to begin with, and I think that's okay. One aggravating part of my early career in this field was in the 80s, there was a whole movement to value non-timber forest products as a way to preserve or to inspire conservation of tropical rainforest. Seemed very logical. The argument was that actually if you leave the forest intact, there's this much money sitting there in rubber and fruits and fibers and medicines and materials. The problem with that rationale is that as soon as you find a higher value reason, that first argument goes away. So timber prices go up, or oil prices go up, or oil palm prices go up, then all of a sudden you've lost your economic argument entirely. And I'm seeing the same is true, this sort of feeding the birds argument, is that, yeah, it makes sense, but the reality is we don't understand fully how well non-native species and invasive species actually support wildlife. We just don't know. And there's not a lot of data out there. So I have come to, as much as my personal perspective means anything, a lot of this is about regional identity. I abhor strip malls. I grew up in New Jersey. I know strip malls. And I hate showing up in Minnesota or in Washington or in Texas and seeing the same strip malls in the same organization. It feels to me that you lose the sort of cultural charm and cultural identity of these locations. And I feel very connected to the cultural identity or the regional identity that is expressed in native species and in native ecosystems. And I'm seeing them disappear. I'm seeing places where I used to be able to walk around and see a lot of pretty remarkable biodiversity. I'm seeing now Microstegium. I'm seeing now monocultures of Berberis. And it's a complex set of reasons why that's true. And so all I can do is do what I can do to try to reverse that trend. So whatever your argument, it might be a wildlife argument, it might be an economic argument, it might be a spiritual argument, it might be an aesthetic argument, or it might be a regional identity argument. You have to believe fully in what you're doing and try to share that inspiration. Because I think we all agree somehow, or all of us in this room, that there is innate and infinite value to this diversity that we have inherited, and why do we feel that we have the right to watch it all disappear? And shouldn't we just start to try to do whatever we can to prevent that from happening? So that's my argument.
And just stemming on what Todd was saying is that we know very little, and every day we're learning more. And more I feel like there are these citizen science initiatives in which you can actually be contributing. Right here in New York State, the governor has had the Natural Heritage Program going out and looking at the state of our pollinators across New York State. You, every person with a smartphone, can contribute data by snapping pictures of pollinators on flowering plants next year using iNaturalist. And they will use that data. You can also go and do training and learn more about that officially starting next, I think, May with the Natural Heritage Program. You can do collection too and not just pictures. The New York City EcoFlora Project is a project in which our scientists, Brian Boom and Daniel Atha, are leading citizen scientists across New York City to find out what spontaneous plants are growing in New York City. Where are they? What are they interacting with? So I think, yeah, we may not know a whole lot on why we're gardening for birds, for pollinators, for stormwater management, whatever it is, but I think we're learning more and more every day, and we can all contribute.
Yeah. All right, maybe we have time for 2 more questions.
Well, I have a question. Yeah, I have a question for the folks from Washington. It's the money question. I'm wondering how you finance all the wonderful work you do, especially the land acquisition part of it.
The land acquisition part, there have been a total of 3,000 acres in the watershed that are now under permanent protection. A lot of that was state land that was converted from active logging on steep slopes above Tarbu Bay. That was converted from logging land to permanent protection, partly to avoid landslides that have occurred in the past. So that was existing state land that's now in permanent protection. There have been a couple land acquisition things, maybe a total of 300 acres, 300 to 400 acres, on maybe 10% of that total were straight out acquisition. And that was funded through a grant program for salmon enhancement that actually is fueled by the sales of marine fuel, so that the idea is that this is a Fish and Wildlife Program. I believe that there's a little bit of money that comes from the sale of stuff that supports commercial fishing and marine uses that goes back into habitat acquisition. So some of the money came from that federal program. A lot of we've donated easements. A lot of the private landowners have donated conservation easements to add up to that 3,000 acre total. Also, the U.S. Navy has been involved helping buy conservation easements, because there's several large Navy bases and they don't like development around where they're trying to shoot torpedoes. So they've been a conservation partner.
Our original property was, we could afford it because who donated the money for the easement? There was an easement on it, so.
The county had a program.
County had a program, so our property value was much lower than normal, so we could afford to get that first property. So we were paying for the easement property, with the easement on it versus developed property.
What about the restoration costs? Do you have a final question up here?
I'd like to hear a little more about your plant-a-thon, the tree planting program with the schools, please.
It started out with 2 schools, and it was a mom and a dad who organized it, and they worked with the schools where their kids were, and they knew a lot of the moms and dads and got it going. And then other schools in the area said, oh, wow, they've got $3,000 or $4,000 coming in every winter. That would be fun. We could, so they got involved. And so now I think there are 4 or 5 schools involved. So it's been volunteer coordinated, and the plant costs are either funded from private donations, or sometimes the group that organizes it gets small grants.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, speakers.